Homeless teacher saves a young millionaire's daughter. What happens next is shocking. The cold wind howled through the dark alley, its sharp bite slicing through layers of worn-out fabric. A man, hunched against the icy wall, clutched a faded book close to his chest. His once proud shoulders now drooped under the weight of years spent on the streets. His name? Ethan Carter. Once a respected teacher, now just another homeless soul lost in the city's oblivion. But tonight, something was different. The screech of tires echoed through the alley, followed by a desperate scream. A black luxury car swerved violently, crashing into a pile of trash bags. The driver's side door flung open, and a man in an expensive suit stumbled out, blood trickling down his forehead. His eyes darted around in panic before landing on Ethan. "Help me!" he gasped, clutching his chest. "They took my daughter! They took her!" Ethan's body stiffened. The desperation in the man's voice was raw, something he hadn't heard in a long time. But why would a millionaire be running for his life in a dark alley? And why would fate bring a homeless teacher face to face with a millionaire's missing daughter? Ethan had no idea, but one thing was certain. This night was about to change everything. Ethan Carter hadn't always been a man forgotten by society. Once he was a highly respected literature teacher inspiring students with stories of resilience, courage, and redemption. But life had a cruel sense of irony. A single wrongful accusation of misconduct by a wealthy parent, an accusation he could never fight against, cost him his career, his home, and his dignity. He had spent the last 5 years surviving on scraps, his only possession being the worn-out copy of To Kill a Mockingbird he carried everywhere. The man now standing before him, bleeding and desperate, was Benjamin Cole, a name Ethan instantly recognized. Benjamin wasn't just any millionaire. He was a ruthless corporate tycoon, infamous for crushing competitors without a second thought. A man whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and controversy. And yet, at this moment, none of that mattered. Benjamin clutched Ethan's arm, his expensive suit now stained with dirt and blood. His hands trembled. His breathing was shallow. This wasn't a man used to feeling powerless. "They took her," Benjamin repeated, his voice breaking. "They took my daughter. My only child." Ethan's instinct kicked in. Years of watching people's body language, of understanding emotions beyond words, told him Benjamin wasn't lying. This wasn't just a rich man panicking over a lost possession. This was a father drowning in terror. "Who took her?" Ethan asked, steady but firm. Benjamin swallowed hard. "I don't know. They called me. They said I'd pay for my sins. They told me if I involved the cops, they'd send me her fingers first." Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple ransom. This was personal. Benjamin pulled out his phone with shaking hands, showing Ethan a blurry image of a terrified young girl, no older than 15, tied to a chair in a dimly lit warehouse. Tears streaked her delicate face. The caption beneath the photo read, "If you want her back, you must suffer like we did." Something about that message struck Ethan deep. It wasn't random. It was a vendetta. But against who? He studied the girl's face. She looked familiar. Too familiar. And then it hit him. Sophie Cole. She had been one of his brightest students, the only student who had ever stood up for him during the scandal that ruined his life. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just some rich man's problem. This was his problem too. The past, which he had buried under years of suffering, had come back, merciless and unforgiving. Benjamin fell to his knees. For the first time in his life, he begged, "Please help me. I have no one else. You're my only hope." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He could walk away. He could let the millionaire handle his own mess. Or he could finally stand up for the one person who once stood up for him. Decision made, Ethan straightened his back. "Let's go find your daughter." The neon glow of the city blurred in Ethan's vision as he and Benjamin hurried down the dark alley. Every step forward felt like plunging deeper into a storm, unpredictable, violent, and unforgiving. Benjamin wiped the blood from his forehead with his sleeve, his breath ragged. "They'll kill her if we don't do something." Ethan nodded, gripping the phone tighter. His mind raced through possibilities. Who were they? Why did they want Benjamin to suffer? His past instincts as a teacher resurfaced, the same instincts that once helped him read between the lines of his students' words. The kidnappers weren't asking for money. They wanted revenge. "Do you recognize the number they called from?" Ethan asked, keeping his pace steady. Benjamin shook his head. "Number blocked." Of course. They were careful. But something wasn't adding up. Why contact Benjamin but dump him in an alley bleeding? Why not hold him hostage too? Unless this is a test, Ethan muttered. Benjamin shot him a confused glance. "What?" Ethan stopped, turning to face him. "They're testing how far you'll go. That's why they let you run instead of keeping you with her. They're watching, Benjamin. They want to see what kind of father you really are." Benjamin clenched his fists. "I'd die for my daughter." Ethan studied him. "Then prove it." The only clue they had was the background of the image, a rusted metal chair, cracked concrete floors, and faint red graffiti on the wall behind Sophie. The letters were half visible. DRA. Ethan frowned. Something about that looked familiar. Benjamin, impatient, grabbed his phone back. "We don't have time to stare at pictures." Ethan ignored the outburst and closed his eyes for a moment, sifting through old memories. Then it hit him. "Dragon's Nest," he said. Benjamin blinked. "What?" "The abandoned factory on 14th Street, Ethan explained. "It used to be a manufacturing plant, but gangs took over. They called it Dragon's Nest. That graffiti, DRA, it's the start of their tag." Benjamin paled. "And you just happen to know that?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Let's just say, when you spend 5 years on the streets, you learn things." Benjamin hesitated, but desperation overruled doubt. "Then let's go." Reaching Dragon's Nest wasn't easy. The factory lay in the city's underbelly, a no-man's land of crime, corruption, and whispered threats. As they moved, Ethan noticed Benjamin struggling to keep up. For all his wealth and power, he was completely out of his element. He wasn't used to being the prey. "Keep your head down," Ethan warned as they crossed a street where hooded figures loitered under flickering streetlights. "Don't look anyone in the eye," Benjamin scoffed. "I've faced worse men in boardrooms." Ethan smirked. "Yeah? Try facing someone who doesn't care about stock prices but would kill you for looking at him wrong." Benjamin fell silent. As they approached the factory, an eerie silence blanketed the area. The metal gates, covered in graffiti and rust, creaked in the wind. Ethan gestured for Benjamin to stay back. "Let me go first." Benjamin frowned but nodded. Ethan slipped inside, his heartbeat sinking with the rhythmic dripping of water from broken pipes. The air smelled of oil, rust, and something rotten. Then he heard it. A muffled cry. He followed the sound, navigating through broken machinery and shattered glass. He stopped behind a rusted pillar, peering ahead. Sophie sat tied to a chair, her wrists bruised from struggling. Her eyes darted around in panic. 2 men in dark masks stood nearby, whispering. Ethan took a slow breath. This was it. He motioned for Benjamin to wait, then crept forward. Then the floor creaked beneath him. A gun cocked. "Move, and you're dead." Ethan froze. He'd walked right into a trap. A figure emerged from the shadows, pressing a cold barrel against his temple. Tall, muscular, eyes filled with hate. "You shouldn't be here," the man growled. Behind him, Sophie gasped, her face lighting up in shock. "Mr. Carter?" Ethan clenched his fists. One of the masked men turned to Sophie. "You know him?" Before she could answer, Benjamin burst in, ignoring Ethan's warning. "Big mistake. The second masked man grabbed him instantly, slamming him against a wall. "Ah, look who finally decided to show up," Benjamin groaned, struggling. "Who the hell are you?" The first man removed his mask. Ethan's stomach dropped. It was Michael Shaw, a former student. Michael's gaze locked onto Ethan, rage burning in his eyes. "You remember me, don't you, Mr. Carter?" Ethan swallowed hard. Of course he did. Michael had been one of his students, brilliant but broken. His father had been fired from a company, Benjamin's company. "You ruined my father," Michael spat at Benjamin. "Your greed left us on the streets. My mother, she didn't survive. And you? You just kept getting richer." Benjamin, breathless, shook his head. "I don't even know who your father was." Michael's face twisted. "Of course you don't. You never look at the people you destroy." Ethan saw Michael's hand tremble on the gun. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a vendetta. "Michael," Ethan said calmly, stepping forward, "this isn't the way." Michael's jaw clenched. "What do you know about loss? You had everything, and you threw it away." Ethan took a deep breath. "I lost everything, too." Michael faltered for a second. "I know what it feels like to have your life ripped away," Ethan continued. "I know what it's like to be abandoned, to scream for justice and hear nothing but silence." Michael's grip on the gun wavered. "Then you should understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "I do," Ethan said softly. "That's why I know this isn't the answer." Silence stretched. Then, bang, a shot rang out. Ethan flinched, expecting pain. But it wasn't him. Benjamin had tackled Michael. The gun clattered to the floor. Chaos erupted. The second masked man lunged at Ethan, but Ethan ducked, grabbed a metal pipe, and swung hard. The man collapsed, groaning. Benjamin and Michael struggled on the ground. Michael, despite his fury, was no match for the older man's brute strength. Ethan rushed to Sophie, untying her. "Run," he ordered. Tears streamed down her face, but she obeyed, bolting toward the door. Ethan turned back, just in time to see Benjamin slam Michael's head against the floor. Panting, Benjamin stood up, glaring down at the broken man beneath him. Ethan grabbed his arm. "Let's go!" Benjamin hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. They ran. Bursting out into the cold night, Sophie sobbed as she crashed into her father's arms. Benjamin held her tight, a changed man. And Ethan? For the first time in years, he felt like a teacher again. The freezing night air burned in their lungs as Ethan, Benjamin, and Sophie sprinted away from the abandoned factory. The echoes of their footsteps bounced against the empty streets, but danger still lurked in the shadows. Ethan's mind raced. Something didn't sit right. The escape had been too easy. Where were the others? The rest of Michael's crew? Benjamin, clutching Sophie tightly, barely noticed Ethan slowing down. "We need to keep moving," Ethan warned. But before they could take another step, headlights flared to life. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking their path. Ethan grabbed Sophie's hand, pushing her behind him. His instincts screamed, this wasn't over. The back door of the SUV swung open. A man stepped out, tall, powerful, and horrifyingly familiar. Ethan's breath hitched. David Shaw, Michael's older brother, the real mastermind. Unlike Michael, who was fueled by raw emotion, David was cold, calculated, deadly. "Going somewhere?" David's voice was smooth, almost amused, a voice of a man who knew he was in control. Ethan's heart pounded. They had just escaped one trap and fallen into another. Benjamin stepped forward. "Take me. Let my daughter go." David chuckled. Touching, but unnecessary. "You see, Benjamin, this was never about you." Ethan's stomach clenched. "What?" David's dark gaze shifted. To Ethan. "You don't get it, do you?" David smirked. "This whole thing was about you, Mr. Carter." Ethan froze. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. David stepped closer, his expression amused. But beneath the amusement was something darker. "You think Michael was the one who wanted revenge?" David shook his head. He was just the distraction. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. "I was the one who set you up," David whispered. Silence. The world around Ethan blurred. "Set him up?" David smiled. "That scandal that ruined your life? That accusation that turned you into a homeless nobody?" He leaned in. "That was me." Ethan's vision darkened. "No," he breathed. "You're lying." David's smirk deepened. "Am I?" It all made sense now. The false accusations, the sudden way everything crumbled, the way no lawyer would take his case, the unseen hand that had destroyed him. It had never been a coincidence. Someone had pulled the strings, and that someone was standing right in front of him. "But why?" Ethan's voice was hoarse. David shrugged. "Because you were in the way." Ethan's mind reeled. "You were just a teacher, right?" David mused. "But you were more than that. You actually cared. You tried to help the kids from the slums. You tried to pull them away from me. From my operation." A sickening realization hit Ethan. David had been recruiting students, using troubled kids from low-income families, pulling them into his criminal empire, turning them into soldiers for his cause. And Ethan? Ethan had been a threat. "You were too good at your job, Mr. Carter," David continued. "Too much of an inspiration. You made those kids believe they had a choice. I couldn't let that happen." Ethan felt his knees weaken. "So you framed me?" His voice was barely above a whisper. David smirked. "I destroyed you." Ethan's hands curled into fists. The rage inside him burned white-hot. 5 years. 5 years of pain, of hunger, of sleeping in the cold, of being spit on, ignored, forgotten, and all because of this man. "Go ahead," David taunted. "I know you want to kill me." Ethan's breaths were shaky. Sophie gripped his sleeve. "Mr. Carter, don't." Ethan's vision blurred. This man had stolen everything from him. And yet, he thought about Sophie, about Michael, about every student he had ever tried to save. Was he going to let David turn him into a monster too? Number Ethan exhaled sharply. Instead of attacking, he took a step back. A choice. His choice. David's smirk faltered. "What, no fight?" Ethan shook his head. "You don't get to define me." For the first time, David looked surprised, and then sirens, loud, blazing, police. David's eyes widened. The trap had been for him all along. Benjamin smirked. "You thought you were the only one pulling strings." Ethan turned in shock. Benjamin nodded toward his watch. "Built-in microphone. You gave us the confession. The cops heard everything." David roared in rage as officers swarmed, guns raised. He lunged for his gun. Bang! A shot to the leg. He collapsed. Michael, still on the ground, watched in horror as his brother fell, his entire empire shattered in an instant. Ethan exhaled. It was over. Hours later, Ethan stood outside the police station, watching the sunrise. Sophie walked up beside him. "You saved me," she whispered. Ethan smiled, exhaustion in his eyes. "You saved me first." Benjamin approached. "You ever think about teaching again?" Ethan chuckled bitterly. "Nobody would hire me." Benjamin smirked. "I own a school. Consider yourself hired." Ethan stared. For the first time in 5 years, he had a future again. And it all started with one choice: to forgive. The morning light spilled over the city skyline as Ethan stood outside the police station, breathing in the crisp air of freedom, freedom from the weight of his past. For 5 long years he had carried a burden that wasn't his to bear, and now, for the first time, he felt lighter. Behind him, Benjamin wrapped an arm around Sophie, holding her close. He had been a ruthless businessman once, a man who never looked back at the wreckage he left behind. But tonight had changed him. He had nearly lost the only thing that truly mattered: his daughter. Sophie turned to Ethan, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" Ethan smiled, a real smile, something he hadn't done in years. "I think I will be." Benjamin stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Look, I don't say this often, but I owe you everything. If you hadn't been there, you would have found a way, Ethan interrupted. Benjamin smirked. I doubt that. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small business card. I own one of the best private schools in the city. They need someone who understands kids, someone who actually cares. Ethan stared at the card. Principal of Cole Academy. His chest tightened. It had been so long since he had stepped into a classroom, so long since he had been more than just a forgotten man on the streets. But Benjamin wasn't done. I want to fix what happened to you. You lost your job because of people like me. People who never looked past their own interests. Let me make it right. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had spent years thinking revenge would set him free. But standing here, looking at Sophie, at Benjamin's genuine regret, he realized justice was never about getting even. It was about building something better. He took the card. I'll think about it. Benjamin smiled knowingly. You'll say yes. The police had taken Michael and David into custody, charging them with multiple crimes, kidnapping, conspiracy, and the web of corruption they had built over the years. Ethan had expected to feel relief, but when he saw Michael being led into the police car, he couldn't shake the familiar sadness in his eyes. A part of him wished things had been different, that Michael had chosen a different path. Maybe if Ethan had been there for him back then, if the world had been kinder, Michael wouldn't have turned into the man he was today. But it wasn't too late. As the car door closed, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would go back. He would teach again. And this time, he wouldn't just tell his students about redemption. He would be living proof of it. As Ethan walked away from the station, he glanced at the rising sun, warmth filling his chest. This wasn't just the end of a dark chapter. It was the beginning of something greater. And maybe, just maybe, second chances were real after all. What defines a person isn't how they fall, but how they rise. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about refusing to let it control your future. Sometimes the greatest revenge is proving that the darkness didn't break you. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you have forgiven, or would you have taken revenge? Let me know in the comments below. Down.